Today I am going to talk to you about the social model of mental health. After I finish my lecture, you will know about the social model of mental health and its importance in community psychology. You will also be able to identify its various assumptions, evaluate the pros and cons of this model, and analyze how it is different from the other models of community psychology. First and foremost, we need to talk about the origin of this model. The social action model evolved during the time of John F. Kennedy's presidency of USA during 1962 to 1964. There was a clear uprising of the standards of America at that time, but only in some areas. Some areas of America were absolutely isolated and not looked after, due to which the condition was beyond worse in those particular areas. The status of people living in America was on absolutely opposite poles. The famous Indian quote is "rich were becoming richer and poor are becoming poorer" fitted perfectly well for that condition. Seeing the state of America, it was decided that strict action would be taken. But soon, the coordinators and the people in charge realized that they were short of all sorts of services and facilities that had to be provided for either psychological or social help. Thus, the idea of eradication of poverty using this technique was dumped, and other causes that led to poverty were looked into. The major issue that arose was the structure of the society itself. Roman and Shimias in 1972 summarized the primary assumptions behind the recognition that new and different approaches were needed during the 1960s. I will tell you about these assumptions. Number one, the need for comprehensive efforts to deal with deep-rooted and interrelated social problems. Number two, the recognition that the sources of these problems lay in the social structure. Number three, the awareness that existing services and facilities were inadequate in dealing with widespread need. And fourthly, the development of community action competence through the organization and involvement of residents would be an important factor in devising effective solutions. Leventhal in 1969 was another researcher who gave some measures which were used in the formulation of social action model, because his ideas mainly revolved around the community action programs. And these were mobilization and coordination of community services, participation of the poor, provision of jobs and improving employability through practice and training, and stimulation of self-employment and development of small businesses through loan programs. Kenneth Clark in 1968 was also one who traced the origins of community participation of the anti-poverty programs. Social action model envisages the participation of social and behavioral scientists, psychologists, sociologists, and social workers employed in government and non-government agencies. Let me tell you about the social action model now. The social action model is a community-oriented model that is used to increase the problem-solving ability of entire communities through achieving concrete changes towards social justice. That is, individuals within communities come together to redress the imbalance of powers or privileges between disadvantaged groups and society at large. The social action approach which has its foundation in the war on poverty strategy, arose out of discontent with structural inequalities and the unresponsiveness of the political apparatus of American society. Their extreme ignorance towards the poverty-stricken areas of America gave rise to this model. Like the mental health model, it is initially aimed at prevention, but the target and the goals are extremely different in both the models, that is, the mental health model and the social action model. Located within the community action program, the poverty programs address itself to the needs of the poor and to the complex nature of interrelated social problems. Thus, in its goal to equalize opportunities for upward social mobility, it sought to make available more social resources to the poor. It simultaneously attempted to alter the social and psychological characteristics of the poverty-stricken in order to prepare them for more meaningful participation in the society. This model criticizes traditional psychology's individualistic orientation that locates pathology solely within the individuals. It asserts that it is imperative to take cognizance of the structural inequities of the society, which may include factors like inadequate housing, overcrowding, the absence of free speech, and political powerlessness. This shift is from prevention to empowerment. Rappaport in 1981 argued that there is a need of shift from prevention to empowerment. He said that the empowerment should be the cell to arms. When prevention is founded on the needs approach, empowerment is based on the right model. Accordingly, Rappaport asserts that because many competencies are already present in people, what required is a release of the potential. Empowerment implies what you thought was impossible for the existing competencies to operate becomes possible. By including power in its explanatory model, the emphasis shifts from blaming the victim to implicating the social arrangements of the society. This means that a prerequisite for empowerment is a redressing of social inequalities. Now, this model conceptualizes community processes and intergroup relations in terms of conflicting interests between groups. Accordingly, it argues that the poor do not have any power, influence, or control in the society. Since the dominant group has vested interests in maintaining political and economic inequities, differences are not easily reconcilable. Logically, then, social action advances the mobilization and organization of an appropriate constituency to exert pressure on the ruling elite. In the South African context, it would probably involve organizing the enfranchised with the view to shifting the power balance and instituting structural changes. By arguing that health is not possible in the context of repression and domination, social action programs address themselves to the issues of finance, power, increasing resources, education, and community development. Rife asserts that self-determination must be an integral part of any social action program. The acquisition of power is a prerequisite for the fulfillment of human needs. For him, the powerlessness of the poor renders self-actualization unrealistic. It is imperative that the working class experience themselves as being able to determine what happens to them, both as individuals and as a group. Some theorists have pointed out that in order to advance and maintain this process of self-determination, community psychology should be a social movement rather than a professional enterprise. Confirmation for this position is provided in the added thrust that community psychology gained from being juxtaposed with a series of civil rights and youth protest actions during the 1960s in the USA. In accordance with its views on the acquisition of power, this model stresses and encourages community participation and equality in community relations, relying on grassroots support for its programs. Now, establishing a power base and commanding grassroots supports are vital. Elinsky in 1972 implicitly pointed out that disempowered cannot achieve their goals without struggle. In accordance with its tenets of self-determination and community control, this model has devised various strategies to foster a sense of power and community participation. This is achieved by increasing community morale, tapping community resources, developing social skills, and generating opportunities for promoting local leadership. As part of its intervention strategy, the social action approach capitalizes on natural support systems. It employs the services of indigenous non-professionals and attempts to mobilize consumers of services to assume control of the activities of the program. Given the assumption that non-professionals are fairly sensitive to the needs of the community, they are considered to fulfill a good liaison function for the professional services. They are able to provide valuable input for program planning and are also in a position to encourage the community to utilize the services. It is argued that because they do not have the same social background as the clients, they are able to interact with a greater degree of therapeutic effectiveness. The amount of trust they receive and the emotional significance that they hold for the clients allows them to render informal support and communication within the community itself. Despite these advantages, experience the world over indicates that the professional or non-professional relationship is often unidirectional. Non-professionals are not always accorded equal status and are perceived to be in need of training and upgrading. The emphasis appears to be on incorporating the indigenous into the professional framework. To foster independence, various multi-purposes locally controlled community development corporations, which are called CDCs, were established in ghetto and rural areas all over America. Functioning on a non-profit basis, these CDCs have been able to promote economic and social developments as well as some degree of political power. They essentially provide a permanent source of income and collective power for the ghetto residents and community as a whole. If programs like this, CDCs, are not an integral part of a broader movement, they run the risk of merely becoming little enclaves with greater scope for self-sufficiency and material advancements. Let me talk to you about the need for social action model. The basic assumptions underlying the social action model were given by Robert Reif. The very first assumption is that traditional psychological views of human behavior are excessively intrapsychic and give sufficient attention to social factors. Now, Reif feels that the mental health model is an inadequate base for psychology of social problems. But this is simply inadequate for understanding of individual behavior at a social level or for understanding the behavior of large groups of people by extrapolation. The second assumption is that there is a need for a body of knowledge about how the social system affects the psychological reactions as well as the knowledge of the operations and modifications or changes that take place in the social system. Rife argues that the need for self-actualization does not have any importance for the poor. Thus, the focus should be on self-determination rather than self-actualization. This is the next assumption, that intervention must have self-determination as their goal. This target or goal can only be achieved by the concentration on the freedom in society. Another assumption is that more emphasis should be given to the relationship between the man and the society, because both are believed to be interacting with one another and interdependent on each other. It is believed that the social action model gives immense importance to the fact that each individual must participate to encourage power sharing. The social action model works from the bottom up. Finally, this model assumes that the power structure of the community tends to be unaware of the needs and requirements of the poor and the alienated, and does not necessarily share the assumption that it is in the community's interest to share power. Let's move on to the intervention programs. There is a need for intervention programs in every domain. Intervention programs have some aims and goals according to which they work. The social action model also takes into account two important assumptions that the intervention programs must have. Number one, organization of consumer of services in the community to control the activities of the programs. Number two, development of members of the target population as service workers in the new program. A major contribution of the social action model is the provision of training of non-professionals who are just like the other members of the community. They are considered as the aides, outreach workers, or facilitators. These individuals are expected to reach out to people in need and help them, to provide careers for the poor in the community. Let's move on to the role of non-professionals. As I talked to you earlier, the social action model gave a lot of unemployed individuals of the society by giving them employment for these intervention programs. These non-professionals are loved and respected by the community members more than the organization members of the government. This is because before the social action model came up, the poor were always excluded from every opportunity of the society. They were not allowed to participate in community institutions and thus kept in a position of powerlessness. The non-professionals provided all those formalities which the government did not provide to the poor. The non-professionals were highly valued by their employees in providing informal support. Let's go on to the assessment of this model. One of the worst consequences of the social action model is that your issue area and movement will be co-opted by others. Local parties and even media can take over a movement and use it for any ends those institutions desire. The social action model tends to underplay the individual's subjective experiences, focusing chiefly and primarily on the antagonistic nature of the interaction between groups in a society. It does not explicitly address the specific ways in which psychopathology develops. Rather, it assumes that in the process of empowerment, problems such as alcoholism, sex abuse, and delinquency should be eradicated. Due to the lack of theory in community psychology that provides the genesis and process of mental health programs, it is unable to say anything about what constitutes mental illness. In locating the causes of social problems to be within the socio-political arrangements of the society, the social action model has attempted to move away from a biological conception. Although it locates the causes of problems of living to be within the social arrangements of the society, it does not challenge the prevailing economic order, which to an extent determines the social relations within the society. Let me summarize the lecture that I have taken with you today. The origin of the social action model was mainly from the war of poverty. This was during the presidency of John F. Kennedy. This model was formulated for the betterment and improvement of the people living in poverty in the USA. During the 1960s, there became a great gap between the poor and the rich. The poor were becoming more poor and the rich people were becoming richer. So the gap was kind of increasing. This caused distress within the society of America. There were a number of researchers and psychologists who put their foot forward to help out the poor. Thus, they formulated their own assumptions and basic outlines of their own theories. Now, the social action model had a number of assumptions that were in favor of the poor population. It was believed by Rappaport that prevention was not important, empowerment was. Now, what is empowerment? I have told you that empowerment is the power to take decisions, to decide for oneself, not to be alienated, to be a part of the mainstream. In order to carry on the programs based on the social action model, non-professionals were trained to help out in the community. It was much easier and efficient to give such a task to the common man itself. And honestly, these people who were non-professionals were accepted more easily in the societies. They were loved, respected, and people kind of thought them to be one of themselves. They trusted them, they thought they were a credible source, and they shared their problems with them. Along with its many plus points, social action model had several drawbacks too, which did not make it the perfect model of community psychology. Because it does talk about the social order in the society, which is the cause of many problems. However, it does not challenge them. So until and unless the social order is challenged, we cannot bring about changes in the society. So the social action model then becomes a toothless tiger. So in order to do away with the drawback, the social action model needs to be empowered itself.